Thank you all for joining us today for another episode of our podcast, Moving to Value Unscripted. My name is Dr. John Rodas. I'm a recovering ex-hospital president and am proud to be the president of the Moving to Value Alliance. The Moving to Value Alliance, MTVA, is a 501c3 nonprofit, is a multi-stakeholder grassroots organization whose purpose, put simply, is to foster a community that aims to create a value-based healthcare ecosystem with high-quality outcomes at a reasonable cost for plan sponsors and their members, beneficiaries, or employees. Our community has grown substantially over the past few years. We started in Connecticut, but now have nearly 1,000 members from more than 40 states all over the U.S., and our members include many value-based influencers. I want to thank our sponsors whose support makes this presentation possible. We'd like to give a special thanks to our trade member sponsor, Sohn Health. We're joined today by my fellow board members, Lisa Trumbull and Dr. Steve Schutzer. Lisa Trumbull is the CEO of Sohn Health, Southern New England Healthcare Organization, a physician-led, clinically integrated delivery system in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Dr. Stephen Schutzer, a nationally renowned arthroplasty surgeon, is one of the founders of MTVA and is the co-founder and president of Upswing Health. Our special guest today is Roy Wilkinson, founder and CEO of Mutual RX. Roy founded Mutual RX to disrupt the traditional pharmacy benefits management model after working as a consultant in the field for many years. Fed up with the lack of transparency and pricing games offered by conventional PBMs, he launched a different approach. Mutual RX functions like a third-party administrator, or TPA, empowering plan sponsors to personalize their pharmacy benefits and reduce costs. Welcome to Moving to Value Unscripted, Roy.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here this morning, and everyone else on the call. Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to speaking with you.
Well, we really appreciate having you. And Roy, let me maybe just kick it off because the timing here, I guess we couldn't have planned it better. This week, 3 CEOs from the traditional PBMs testified before Congress. Of course, we're talking CVS Caremark, United's Optum RX, and Cigna's Express Scripts. And if I have it right, they control anywhere between 80 to 90% of the PBM market. And they talked about how much money they were saving the American people. It reminded me of, I've heard one of those CEOs in the past say, when asked by an interviewer, what keeps you up at night? And his answer was one word: disintermediation. Because they're the middleman, right? And he feared that someone would come between them and the folks that are buying the products. So I thought of them, and I thought of you, and I said I had to ask you let's start with just kind of what got you into this game, because I think I might have just answered the question, and tell me a little bit more about what Mutual X actually does for employers.
Sure, great. Well, in the beginning, as you mentioned, we've had a pharmacy advisory consulting firm for a number of years, where we help plan sponsors in really all market sectors, public sector, employer groups, unions, as well as health systems and health plans, with any issue related to prescription drugs. So that would include helping them with their procurements, evaluating PBM proposals. We have a number of clinicians so we can assist with reviewing clinical management programs that get presented to clients from their PBMs, as well as doing PBM auditing and any other type of reimbursement contracting or assessments related to the prescription drug program. And it was really in that role that the idea of Mutual RX germinated. We actually talked about direct contracting as a technique or a tool for probably 20 some years on the consulting side, preaching that gospel of, why do you need a third party middleman to manage these transactions? And it was from that foundation that we said, there's an opportunity today. This was back, I don't know, probably about 2015 or 16, talking to a client that said, why in the heck are we paying this big 3 PBM all this money to process a pharmacy claim when we have our own administrative services company, which they did. They pretty much operated like their own insurance company. They had claims examiners and a medical director and really all the components. They did their own contracting and reimbursement contracts with their provider network. So they said, well, gee, we're paying to process a pharmacy claim. We can do that, couldn't we? And I said, yeah, you probably can. The technology has advanced, and I think the climate the environment for doing such a project really presents itself today. So let's check it out, see what we can come up with. And that was really the beginning of what turned into Mutual RX, where we tried to disintermediate the components that a comprehensive PBM provides and say, if we weren't tied to fulfillment, if we were only interested in the administrative services element as an operating philosophy, couldn't we go out and negotiate with best-in-class solutions for the various components? So whether it was mail order or specialty drugs or disease management or data analytics, whatever the component might be, we would act in a function as if we were part of that plan sponsor's staff and continually look to upgrade and improve the service that was being provided. And we would be able to be compensated like a TPA on a pure administrative service fee that would be fully transparent, fully disclosed, and maybe more importantly, fairly priced so that the client could understand and, to your point, I think in your organization, assess the value of that relationship. So that was the premise. And we thought, well, this is sort of like a mutually beneficial relationship. So Mutual RX sounds like a pretty good name to describe the relationship. And I said, coming from the risk management background, this is maybe similar to a mutual insurance company where you don't really have any outside shareholders, where your members in effect own the organization. I said, well, we'll structure it like that. We'll create an opportunity. And that was done really to develop trust within the organization, because what this client originally expressed to me, they said, our current PBM tells us they're transparent and they tell us they're going to pass through all of the rebates, but we have no way of knowing or testing that theory. So we really don't believe what they tell us.
What they told Congress, by the way. That's what they told Congress too, that they pass along most of the rebates, they said.
Yeah, exactly. So we said, what kind of structure could we incorporate into this model that might support that level of trust that's necessary? So we came up with a model that allowed each client to have their own P&L and adjust how much control they really wanted out of their pharmacy benefit. Because quite frankly, in some coalitions, right, it's not uncommon to have one of the larger members do most of the heavy lifting for several of the smaller groups that participate. And sometimes that goes, smoothly, and other times it creates some friction between the members. Because in the example that I had in starting Mutual RX, one of the large payers said, gee, we're going through all the, efforts to manage not just our pharmacy benefit, but healthcare in general. And at the end of the year, some of the other members that have elected not to do much in terms of medical management or pharmacy management, they get to benefit from our efforts. And when it comes to distributing rebates, we're in effect subsidizing these other plans' rebates. So we'd like to have a little fairer split in that arrangement. And so that we thought, well, in our proposed model, it allows that to happen, because if you are the kind of plan that really tries to avoid member disruption at any cost and wants to stay away from various clinical management initiatives like step therapy or like a higher percentage of prior authorizations, or maybe a more aggressive and controlled formulary, then you probably shouldn't have earned the benefit of sharing the plan's impact for those plans that really do want to be a more aggressive manager. So that was really sort of the background. And from there, it just sprung forward. We were lucky enough to find, other plan sponsors around the country that said, you know what, that's sort of what we've been looking for. And it's funny because when I am talking to a group of brokers or consultants and we're trying to tell the Mutual RX story, I sometimes get asked, who are you looking for? Who's the perfect customer for you or a client? And I say, well, bring me the angry client. That's what I want. I want someone that has
happy and angry client.
I want the angry client that has, gone through a horror story and recognized that they are not getting the value that they had originally thought they were or bargained for, and that they recognize, identify it, and they want to do something about it. And so that's who we want to talk to.
It's the guy shouting out the window, "Enough is enough. I can't take it anymore."
Yes, exactly.
Well, you should, if you're looking for angry clients, you should be very busy these days, right? But I remember in our prep call, you thought when you launched Mutual RX that they would be banging your doors down. And it reminded me, John, of launching our bundle payment for joint replacement here in 2010. We thought we had the first mover advantage. It was 40% less than commercial rates. It had a warranty, and no one showed up for 7 years. So,
Yeah.
And Steve, when they did show up, they came from California and Florida and Chicago, but they couldn't
That's
come
right.
from like Glastonbury, Connecticut, right?
that
10
is
miles away.
so true. That's so true. But you need a PhD to understand the mathematics of this whole space, Roy. I was only a B student in math, so when I look at acquisition costs and AWPs and MACs and WACs, that's the only way I can imagine where these three PBM leaders could say that they only have less than 5% margin and all of the rebates go to someone else. How does that work out?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I used to tell clients when we were consulting, I'd say, have you ever wondered why every quarter the publicly traded PBMs get to announce record earnings for that earnings call if they are doing such an effective job at reducing your costs and working on your behalf? Yet that's their result. So they don't seem to sync in terms of strategy or operating philosophy.
Well, right. And if you look at their operating costs, right, you look at what PBMs spend and the money they throw around to encourage utilization of particular drugs and, their benefits and bonus structures internally and everything. You can take any amount of profit off of, the pharmaceutical process of selling the drugs and reduce your margin to 5% just by spending more, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that it's like a vicious circle, right? We're just, oh no, we only make a 5% margin, but that's because we gave out like millions of dollars in bonuses and we give trips away and we do all that other fun stuff, right? So going back to the pricing of pharmaceuticals, Roy, what's the difference between how you approach pricing versus, a CVS, Caremark, or other PBM structure that most people know today?
Well, one of the whipping posts that have gotten sort of a lot of publicity in the last several years and has been the subject of a number of these congressional committee investigations, also at the FTC and also at the state legislative level, has been this concept of spread pricing. So spread pricing and rebates are the two elements in pricing that have been called on the carpet for accountability and exposure.
Roy, for our listeners, expand on spread pricing. I think we know what it is, but could you just share?
Sure. Well, it sounds conceptually pretty benign because it's sort of the foundation of a capitalistic business model where you try to buy low and sell high. And that's how a business stays in business and makes money. But I think the problem when you apply it to the prescription drug world is the egregiousness of the pricing spreads. I don't think anyone or very few people actually expect prescription drugs to be offered, for free or at a loss or with no or very limited profit margin. But the question is, how much is enough? And when you see these public testimonies being given and analytics being presented on how big these spreads actually are, it's almost impossible to justify or to support when, a drug that is available through certain venues at $10 is all of a sudden being offered to a state Medicaid plan for $2,000 or $4,000. And it's those kind of examples that I think get both public figures in terms of legislative people and organizations and various groups such as yours and others that see the magnitude of the potential problem and says there's got to be a different way, of doing this. So spread pricing is when the PBM, who is supposed to be the transactional middleman between getting drugs from a manufacturer and a wholesaler into the hands of the consumer, the patient. And they generally work for the plan sponsor, which is an employer, or it can be as I said, a state group or a health system. Whoever is responsible for paying the bill is considered the payer. So you've got these transactions where the PBM will pay for a particular prescription at one cost point or price point. And I use the example that the independent pharmacies like to scream about, that they fill a prescription and they may get a reimbursement from the PBM of $20. And then the PBM takes that, and when they go to bill the payer, let's say it's an employer, they turn around and they bill the employer $100 or $150. And so that difference between what they have to pay the pharmacy versus what they get reimbursed from the payer is considered the spread. And so we tell our clients, the reason transparency is important is you can't assess value without knowing what stuff costs.
Right.
And so how can you possibly understand whether or not you're receiving value from your PBM if the pricing model has been purposely designed to sort of keep you in the dark, that proverbial black box that no one seems to know what are the elements that make up the price. So that's the dilemma.
Obfuscation of pricing is the essence of the U.S. healthcare system, but it's not just pharmacy. But yeah, we get it. Steve, I'm sorry, you had a question.
Roy, we've all, I guess, have our value-based roots with Porter and Kaplan at the Harvard Business School. John and I took that course over 10 years ago, where we look at healthcare value as the outcomes that matter to a patient for their particular condition over the true cost. So it really is patient-reported outcomes as a numerator, and, for example, TDABC as a denominator. And why hasn't that been applied to the pharmacy space? What does a drug cost, and what are the outcomes of that drug? I mean, it seems like it could be that easy.
I think you're exactly right. It could be, and from my perspective, it should be. However, there's a reason that over the last 45 years, the PBM model has been the darling of Wall Street, because it makes a heck of a lot of money for its investors.
Right.
And if you ask the plan sponsors and the patients, maybe not so much, because it generally comes on their shoulders as to how this business is so profitable for the PBMs and their investors. But you're right, it should be that simple of trying to assess value.
Today you can buy a car with all the options and the price listed with complete transparency, and shop around and look at different models and look at consumer reports and say, okay, yeah, maybe I'm going to spend this amount of money and I made a good investment, right? Yeah. But you can't do that with something you need to save your life, like a prescription. It's hard, even when you try to shop around. I was looking on your website, and you've got a transparency tool with your app that's pretty cool, that shows where you can buy the drug and how much it costs at each location, right? And I understand that there's markups and things like that, but the markup and sales process of pharmaceuticals is insane. And it's one of the primary reasons why many are seeking their pharmaceutical supplies outside of the country, because you can get it cheaper elsewhere because they don't have these issues. And so the other part of the pricing model, I think, is the markup for recovering R&D costs, right? Which is another insane lack of transparency part of the process. And and I'm wondering, if there's so much disdain for the pharmaceutical industry and there are so many upset employers, what do you think is the biggest impediment to employers switching to something like what you're offering as a way to bend the curve on their costs on pharmaceuticals and give their employees access to the pharmaceuticals that they need to improve their health at a lower cost?
Yeah. The status quo is a very difficult inertia to overcome, we discovered. People, even though they may say the right things in a discovery meeting of different vendors or different processes or different ideas, they may express agreement or even get sort of excited about, thinking this is a wonderful proposal. But when it actually comes down to taking action, as that old adage is, the devil that you know is maybe safer or better than the devil that you don't. So anyone that's sort of on the new and maverick side of the table, even though your idea might be fantastic, gets challenged. And unfortunately, it doesn't always get expressed during the meeting, because I would love, if someone has an objection, to tell me what it is and we can talk about it. What I find frustrating is when people are nodding their heads and smiling and saying, you're right. But then I leave the room, and then, their committee meets and says, we're not sure. This sounds okay. But we know what we have with one of the big PBMs that we've worked with for a number of years, and we don't get a lot of gripes from our members. So what if this whole new concept blows up, and
Right.
we're not going to be left on the other side of the phone trying to field all of this flack that's coming in? So why don't we just stay ahead?
But Roy, I get to see that, and I know CHROs always are reluctant to make changes because that's how they lose their jobs as employers. And I get how there's reluctance to get between their employees and their doctors and say, yeah, if you need a hip replacement, you should go to hospital A versus hospital B because it's actually better outcomes and lower cost. And I actually can see the reluctance to that, even though I think ethically, morally, that's the right thing to do. But when you talk about drug spend, which is what, anywhere from 10 to 30% probably of the total health care spend for an employer, which is a big chunk of money. I think, isn't that more of a commodity? Don't they? If you say to them, hey guys, you know how much you spend on, I used to know how much I spent on paper and ink for my copy machines in a $1 billion business, but I didn't know how much I spent on atorvastatin or insulin for that matter. When you put it that way and say, you know what, this isn't a fixed cost the way you think about it, it's a variable cost. Why don't you shop like you shop for everything else? I can't imagine why. I know I'm reiterating Steve's question, at Lisa's question. Why wouldn't an employer want to change and say, well, I'd like to buy my insulin at a lower price than my atorvastatin at the Walmart prices?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the good news is that ship is beginning to turn. It's a slow turn, but I'm sure you see it with your members. It's starting. The message is getting out there, and people are starting to come to that conclusion. Now, we have seen newer PBMs. I call it the new wave PBMs. There's probably about 80 PBMs operating in the country, but if you ask a head of HR in any major Fortune 500 company, they can probably maybe name 2, let alone anything under the top 5. So there's a number of players who are fighting for the balance, whether it's 15% of the market or 20% of the market, if we're going to be optimistic, are all scrambling to say, listen to me, I've got a better way of doing it. But what we're seeing in terms of the acceptance of these newer ideas is coming from 2 fronts. Number one, the new PBMs are dependent on change coming from the market. Where all of a sudden you have a board or a committee saying, no, we're not going to accept the same proposals that we've seen for the last 10 years. This is a beauty contest that happens every 3 years. We go out to bid and we get the same proposals and we get the same outcomes. So no, we're not going to do that. And all of a sudden, new players get invited to the party to submit their ideas. So that's a great thing. And that's the market-driven approach that we had all hoped for, but it takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think, Steve, as you pointed out, I said, gee, I was hoping our phones would burn up, and it didn't. So it does take a long time. The second strategy that actually is an organized strategy is depending on governmental oversight and regulation to help gently, push these plans, maybe not so gently in some cases, toward the idea of, no, you owe it to your members. The courts may say you're not a fiduciary. However, we think that you have a responsibility, and we as plan sponsors have a responsibility to our members, our employees, our participants, to show that we are good stewards of the assets of this plan, and we have to look for value as a result. So we're seeing that, where different states have either litigated against, I think we just saw a statement that Vermont just this past week sued a couple of their PBMs on behalf of members in the state. Ohio has done that. Hawaii, Indiana, Illinois. There's been more than a handful of states that have taken that course of action. And then we see the FTC is going to come out with a report. The Oversight and Accountability Committee is going to come out with a report. All of them sort of trumpeting the same conclusion that spread pricing and rebate retention and unfair business practices and market conduct that has gone on in the status quo is unacceptable. And then when you see a case like the J&J case that got a lot of publicity earlier this year, where, oh my gosh, all of a sudden your employees are litigants. So it caught, I know, a lot of large employers shockingly by surprise, right? And we know of several law firms who are proactively and aggressively trolling for wronged participants that can be part of a class action case. But the point is that they're making the claim and trying to support the case that all of these otherwise and long-term market conduct and business practices that more traditional PBMs have followed is coming on the backs of the plan and specifically their members. And when drugs are overpriced, as we all believe that they are, we know the negative impact that pricing and cost is the number one reason why a patient doesn't stay on their medication regimen. So it does come to your point about, there is a measurable outcome analysis that can be done and how cost is attributed to not just patient satisfaction, but actual healthcare outcome, health status improvement. So, it becomes a significant and important point to pursue.
Ray, one of your quotes on your website caught my attention. To make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. I thought I was going to say legs, maybe, but you got to break some eggs. And
Roy's not violent, Steve. No, come on.
I know. But you might need to
got a martial arts background, Roy. That's
why. You might take that, John. Come on, we're from New York.
I'm on mood medication, so I'm very mellow.
He's from the Bronx,
But then, just to dive into your model a little bit more, you go into how Mutual RX uses technology. So what I understand is that one of the downsides to rebates is that it loads up the plan sponsor's formulary with junk. I mean, junk drugs that have no value. They just get put on there. So how do you use your technology, Mutual RX, in that particular space, and how is it going to advance your business model?
Well, a couple of ways. Number one is when we present our value proposition, we talk about strategies for formulary creation. And the one that you just mentioned is sort of the chasing rebate approach, which we really saw really pick up steam back in about 2013 or 2014. We saw it at the time. If you recall, there was a new drug introduced to not just curb the side effects of hepatitis C, but cure hep C, right? And it took the market by storm. This is sort of the big wonder drug prior to weight loss and diabetes medications today. But it took the industry by storm. And what PBMs did is they were filling prescriptions faster than they had supply. And a number of state Medicaid programs had to start warehousing patients over potential hep C patients because they just didn't have the resources or the assets to pay for all of that medication. And all of a sudden, there was not just one new product introduced in the market, but 2 and 3 and 4. So PBM saw an opportunity to say, if you're the class leader in this therapeutic category, what if we went to you and said, what would it be worth if we would eliminate your number 2 and number 3 competitor from this class and make you the only game in town on our formulary? What would that be worth? And boy, the manufacturer.
Just unbelievable.
Yeah, that's a
huge. The level of collusion in this process is unbelievable.
Yep, that's a huge bonus. And, we will bump your rebate by 30% if you do that for us. So all of a sudden you saw large PBMs announcing, new modifications And they were doing this for the benefit of the plan sponsor, they claimed. But yet it really got that snowball rolling that now, not just once in a while, but certainly every year, there were going to be this kind of jockeying with the formulary. So from a technology perspective, you wanted to be able to, number one, have the analytic ability and the tools. And, it seems like every app that's being built in the last 2 years, you have to assign AI to it somewhere in order to get people to look at it. But there is the technology to do a wonderful job at assessing whether there's any real value in changing your formulary, or whether or not the new product is really what we call a Me Too addition with no clinical value other than a higher price. So that's the first element. The second element in technology that really helps is being able to have a dynamic pricing tool that enables a plan sponsor to not just see, but to have their patients actually obtain drugs from the lowest cost source. And whether that originates from the plan design that the sponsor has, or whether it's part of a redesign that would incorporate patient assistance programs or manufacturer couponing. Or a third option might be, as I think you mentioned, Lisa, the international sourcing option as yet another source. And then you throw in other independent mail order facilities around the United States that are offering drugs at true acquisition costs. You have a number of opportunities to shop that prescription and come up with a lower or lowest cost alternative. And the technology allows you not just to identify it, but then pursue it and make the arrangements to have it fulfilled for the plan and their member. So that's the approach we're taking. Again, we just view ourselves as part of the plan sponsor staff charged with the responsibility of managing the plan to the lowest net cost with the addition of a patient-centric outcome approach, and then making suggestions and recommendations, and then it's up to the plan to decide.
Let me ask, we had on a couple of ERISA lawyers from McDermott, Will and Emery recently, and these guys have been in the game for a long time, and they're kind of shocked that the Consolidation Appropriation Act from January of 21, so now we're 3.5 years into it, is very, very clear. It has hundreds of pages devoted to this and pages devoted to the pharmacy spend, saying that employers, and you've alluded to this, employers have fiduciary responsibility to manage their health plan to the benefit of the folks paying into the plan, which is the employees and, of course, the employers, number one, just like they manage their pension. So it's very clear. Any employer knows what they do regarding their retirement funds and pension plan. And they've been totally ignored for the most part. This is like the 70s when they changed the speed limit nationally, and everybody's still going 75 miles an hour, like ignoring the new speed limit. And, people started getting tickets, of course, and then everybody started adhering to the law. But somehow in this particular case, there's no adherence. So if I understand your model, you're not a PBM yourself. You come into an employer and say, hey, let's try to fulfill your obligation to the CAA because it's the law now. And let's look at the drugs you're spending, what you're spending your money on. And we think you could save X amount of money by switching to this and that. To that point, how much money on average would you say you can save most employers? Not in dollars, not nominal, but on a percentage basis of total spend. How much can you save them? What's the range typically?
I would say a fair average is 20%, but the range can be 15 to 50% of what we've seen. So in some cases, it's extraordinary. You can get up to 35, 40% or even more. As I said, in a few cases, almost 50%.
Wouldn't that go a long way? And Steve and Lisa chime in. Don't you think that alone would go a long way to fulfill, at least in part, the employer's obligation to fulfill their responsibility as fiduciaries?
Absolutely. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling.
I was involved in a case. I serve as an expert witness in litigation cases involving PBMs, in some cases pharmaceutical manufacturers. And in this particular case, Taft-Hartley Union Welfare Trust had a group of trustees in place for a long, long time. And they never went out to bid, and they never audited. And it was over a course of, I think, 14 years. And finally, they got into some financial trouble as a trust. And so a new plan, a new group of trustees, in effect, absorbed the old plan and took over the plan assets and the members, et cetera, et cetera. But, they were so shocked when they saw the lack of attention, they decided they were going to sue all of the old trustees personally for ignoring their responsibility to the trust. And it was a pretty messy case. But, there was an example, to your point, I think, of just ignoring what you're supposed to do and thinking, status quo is okay. We're not going to go out to bid. We're just going to do the same old, same old. And it came at the expense of the members. And in a union plan or a large Taft-Hartley plan, the members are paramount to their trustees. And so that was particularly important, and the conduct was egregious to the new trustees. So I think plans of all types have that obligation and that responsibility. As you said, part of CAA responsibility is actually act as a fiduciary.
Roy, certainly with CAA, it adds a layer of responsibility to the employer to do their due diligence in this area. And early on, you had mentioned some political or legislative activities. And I'm wondering if you have any insight to, what the feds may be looking at beyond, what we already know, or do you anticipate any changes in this area to be helpful to employers beyond what CAA does?
Gosh, I hope so. I've been wishing this wish for at least 15 years. PBM lobbyists are some of the most effective I've ever encountered. I guess maybe the oil industry as well. But until recently, very recently, every time a state would express the initiative of not just giving lip service to the problem, but actually doing something and passing legislation. I think most famously, there was legislation passed in Maine, the state of Maine, and also in the District of Columbia were the two, I guess, most publicly reviewed outcomes. And they had some legislation with teeth, because usually it gets cut off at the committee level. The House comes up with something, the Senate comes up with something else, or vice versa. And before it gets to the governor's desk, the lobbyists step in, and all of a sudden the initiative dies on the vine. If not watered down, died on the vine. But in the case of the example I'm thinking of in the state of Maine and in the district, they both actually passed pretty aggressive legislation that put big curbs on. And this is probably going back at this point 10 years. And unfortunately, what we have seen historically is that if something gets passed, it gets to be in play for maybe a year or two. And usually the legislation is, okay, it's passed in 2024, won't be effective till 2026, right? That's the way it's written. And between now and 2026, the lobbyists are like busy beavers. They're out there chipping away at that thing. And before it actually becomes effective, all of a sudden it's repealed. And that's what happened in both of those cases. So historically, we have not seen a very good track record to give us a lot of optimism. And what has happened in more recent times is the PBM reform movement turns into a watered down version of, well, we're really not going to regulate your behavior, but we'll have you register. You'll fall under the auspices of the state insurance department. And you'll at least have to be licensed and registered with the state insurance department, and they'll have the ability to come in and do audits. And that's about the extent of the actual regulatory control that has been able to gain any kind of footing. There are a couple of states now that have done some things related to pharmacy disclosure of MAC lists, maximum allowable cost lists at the pharmacy level, and a few other things. So again, it's making some progress, but in answer to your question, how optimistic would I be? It's a great political football. We've seen political candidates, whether it's for president or Congress people, they like to talk about the exorbitant cost of prescription drugs, but I do not expect to see a major change for at least an effective date of maybe 3 years into the future. So.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that question, Roy, knowing the long cycle it takes to affect real change. Forget about how do we get here, right? Because That's a whole nother discussion. Everybody gets all worked up, but somebody allowed it to happen. So what do you think? I mean, there's going to be pressure from the plaintiff bar. There's going to be pressure from the public. There are suits, obviously, from plaintiffs. What is your vision for the next 3 to 5 years? And how do you think Mutual X can accelerate any effective change?
Well, I hope and I like to believe that results speak volumes. And, anyone can appear at a conference. God knows there's no shortage of healthcare conferences. And so you can buy your little table and put your booth up, beautiful streamers and all the things that go. You've got the new way of doing it. We're really transparent. We're the good guys in the white hats. But none of that really has the impact of being able to say, here's a list of client sponsors that we've helped. This one saved 20%, this one saved 25%, this one saved 30%. And being able to have that and have people willing to speak enthusiastically about the results, I think goes a long way in championing the cause. Everyone needs a champion that's not considered an insider, or on the payroll. You've been paid to say that. So, a legitimate user that can talk about the customer experience, can talk about the value prop is great. And I think from my personal experience and perspective, having those from a financial oversight responsibility, like a CFO, I would like nothing more than to have a group of CFOs be able to chit chat over coffee or dinner about how wonderful their Mutual RX experience was. And boy, if you haven't looked at their proposal, you should consider it.
Yeah.
That to me is probably the most powerful sales message.
That makes sense.
I think to Steve's point, the forces are awfully aligned all of a sudden, right? Between public policy, the CAA, Transparency Act, and others. And then you have litigation, which often gets people's attention, which is getting people's attention. You start suing some of the trustees, to your point, some of the board members individually get sued. That'll get a lot of employers' attention. And then you have your space. This space is the one that, in my mind, is the easiest. I know it's complex the way the money flows. You could watch Eric Bricker's presentation on this and kind of learn a lot about it. But the pharmacy, if you look at drugs as a commodity, once you get price transparency, or what do you guys call it on your website, transparency? I love that. I love that term.
Thank you.
But I think it's actually going to come. I think the change is going to come, my sense, and it is going to probably take 3 years we're talking about. I think the employees, particularly the unions. I was looking at doing some work with 32BJ, which, of course, is a union of, kind of janitors and porters and stuff in the tri-state area. And, when they were looking at their spend and their negotiated increases that they were getting, for every dollar they were able to negotiate as a union, 40 cents was going to their health plan. And they were like, well, we're not really getting much of this benefit. It's not like we're really getting a dollar per hour raise. We're getting like 60 cents an hour when we negotiate an hour. And that's what made them take responsibility. I think as more union folks started paying attention to this, realizing they've been kind of getting robbed in many ways they could rather get a raise. They're just spending more money on healthcare. I think between the employees rising up, between employers having this fiduciary responsibility, litigation has an awful lot. Steve alluded to this already. At least I think there's an awful lot of pressure coming down for change. Really, in my sense, for the first time in a long time, that all these things are happening at the same time. Would you agree with that?
I do, but I also am, I always describe myself not just as an optimist, but I say, with me, the carafe is 3/4 full. So I don't stop at the glass. So I am very, very optimistic. That being said, however, I've experienced the ability for the status quo to stay in place. And originally, Mutual RX envisioned, to your point, that unions and Taft-Hartley plans would be our primary audience.
Right.
For the reasons you stated, we thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly. I remember telling different trustees, you've spent so much time in collective bargaining. Every dollar that you get from your signatory employers that participate in this trust is a dollar that could either go to wages or benefits. So why in the heck would you take these plan assets and distribute them to publicly traded other shareholders of these other companies, these other PBMs? That's almost criminal that you're doing that. And they were like, oh yeah, you're right. It is. And our original tagline was, your members, their money.
I think one of the problems is the reason that the political process is able to carry on is that the average consumer doesn't even understand this. They just know their drugs are expensive. They don't know they're paying 30, 40, 50% or sometimes 200% more than what they could be paying. They kind of know you can get it cheaper in another country, but they don't know what to do about it, right?
But yet even that in the US, right, with insulin, the $35 cap
Exactly.
on copays. The diabetic just wants to know they're going to get their insulin at $35. If it costs $1,500 to their employer, they don't really care about that, but they just want to know that 35 is what they have to pay.
Yeah, well, that's the essence of some of the challenge in healthcare. Nobody really knows what anything really costs. And you said that earlier. And, I go to the drugstore and I pay $5 for whatever my prescription is and my copay. And in my mind, that's how much it costs, right? But it really could cost hundreds of dollars that is embedded either in my taxes for Medicare or taxes for Medicaid or in my premiums I've been paying to my employer. It's all embedded in that, and no one really makes that connection.
Exactly.
To figure out the freaking cost, the denominator of the equation. It's hard enough to figure out the numerator, to be honest with you. That's very complicated. But if everybody knew the true cost, the actual dollar spent for the condition, which is the essence of the equation that Porter talked about how long ago now, more than 15 years ago. Well, Roy, I think we're running out of time, but I want to just thank you so much on behalf of Steve and Lisa. I thank you so much for what you do. I think people like you and we've had AJ Liacono out there and CapRx and Mark Cuban, God bless him, for entering this space, and the many others now that are out there trying to go against the disintermediation is the word that really comes to mind. I'm not that much of a wine drinker, so I don't know if it's my carafe is half 3/4 full, but my glass is certainly half full. For the first time in a long time, I really feel like change is afoot. The aircraft category started to turn around. So thanks so much, Roy, for joining us today. And we're very appreciative.
Thanks for having me. This has been fun. I've enjoyed speaking with all of you and your audience. So thanks again. We'll keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks, Roy.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.